In this video, I'm going to break down and explain every single character in Poppy Playtime, adding up to over 70 toys, dissecting all of their lore, secrets, and everything in between. I did this last year, and since then, there's been a lot of new characters and updates to old one stories. So going by order of appearance, let's get started with Huggy Wuggy. Huggy Wuggy was created in 1984 as a stuffed animal featuring soft blue fur, long lanky limbs, and had Velcro on both the feet and hands so that way he could be posed in different ways and hug the children that played with them, since during market research they found that anxious children liked a toy that they could be physically attached to. He was a huge success, spawning many variations of him I'll discuss later in this video. But eventually, after the creation of the Bigger Bodies Initiative, where Playtime Co. made real-life toys out of human bodies, they turned Huggy into an actual monster, Experiment 1170, to be the security guard of the factory, living up in the lobby to both watch for intruders and be a tourist attraction for guests. This experiment was a massive success at first, since he was known for being obedient and calm with the staff that were working with him, while also still being intelligent, a perfect blend for Playtime Co. However, over time, it was revealed that Huggy had one big flaw, which was that he had the tendency to throw deadly fits when put under stress. Like in 1992, he actually managed to escape the factory, eating everything he found in sight, including animals and multiple employees trying to stop the beast, until finally they tranquilized him outside of this building that he was just chilling at. Or another time, when trying to condition him down in the labs like they did with all the other toys, he completely freaked out and attacked the staff once again. However, later on, they actually solved this issue by creating Huggy a friend, Kissy Missy, who, being his companion, kept him calm in times of distress. This solved most of Huggy's issues, and he from here was functioning and calm for the rest of Playtime Co.'s existence. Well, at least that is until the Hour of Joy, when he and every other experiment decided to eat every human being inside of the factory instead. In the games that take place a decade later in 2005, we first encounter Huggy still as a statue, like he was never alive, only for him to suddenly disappear when we take our eyes off him and stalk over us while we continue our journey, leading to him finally pouncing on our way out of the Make a Friend room, forcing the player into the vents, where thankfully, after narrowly escaping and dropping a box on him, he was seemingly dead as he fell dozens of stories below. However, after finding blood stains and Huggy fur on the water treatment pipes during Chapter 2, we were reminded of his existence, and even had a nightmare all about him attacking us in Chapter 3, only for us to make it to the labs in Chapter 4 and find out that he didn't just survive his fall, but had been repaired and was ready to attack us once again. In Chapter 5, he is in full rage mode, trying to kill us anytime we were in his line of sight throughout the entirety of the game, until we made it to the reanimation train station with Kissy Missy, and with her presence, like old times, Huggy was finally calmed down, only to be stabbed and left either dead or nearly dead by the prototype, who, trust me, I'll talk about a whole lot later, along with his friendly counterpart, Kissy Missy. After Huggy was such a big success, Playtime Co. recolored him to pink and added eyelashes to create the toy Kissy Missy, Huggy's own Minnie Mouse and better half. As mentioned, after Huggy's various crash outs as a bigger body, an experiment version of Kissy, Experiment 1172, would be made to essentially be his emotional support ally. And while this did work in terms of calming Huggy down when he needed it, it was seemingly harder to find other uses for Kissy as an employee, which was the main purpose of creating these experiments after all, because she was extremely quiet and suffered from heavy anxiety, especially after being transported to the prison for an unknown reason. And while they tried to get her to do any kind of physical labor, she was always unsuccessful because she was so nervous and had feelings of, quote, impending doom. So under guidance guidance of the head of Playcare, Stella Graber, they allowed Kissy to socialize with other experiments, which calmed her down a little bit, eventually transferring her to Storage B so that she could work in a quiet and empty setting. However, on August 8th of 1995, the day of the Hour of Joy, the employees attempted to send Kissy to Playcare for whatever reason, and during the transfer, she partook in the infamous attack as well, breaking herself from the restraints and attacking all employees around her. A decade later in the game, Kissy seems to be our friend despite us being a former worker, pulling a lever to a gate that we needed to pass in our first encounter with her in Chapter 2. Then in Chapter 3, now in Playcare, Kissy was still clearly under a lot of stress, accidentally pouncing us outside of Home Sweet Home out of pure fear, and rubbing her arms, constantly looking around everywhere for the rest of the game, which I guess seemed to be for good reason, as when going down the lift in Chapter 3 with our other ally, Poppy, she was attacked by a mysterious individual believed to be the prototype, and barely survived with severe injuries, only saved when cared for by the people of Safe Haven, a little community of friendly toys down in the prison that found refuge in an old safe room the employees made in the event of an emergency. However, after the prototype blew up the Safe Haven and then the vent her and Poppy were hiding in afterwards, while Poppy narrowly escaped through a small opening, Kissy took the dynamite blow and tried to hold us up, leading to her losing an arm. Despite this, she seemingly followed Poppy through the shaft to try to find her, only for both of them to fall into Sweet Street and get captured by Lily Lovebraids, who then imprisoned the two until we made our way over there to find and eventually let them out. Or at least that is until Lily traps us for her tea party and the prototype comes for Poppy, leading to Kissy once more breaking into outrage, attacking the prototype and saving us from his wrath. Of course, until we finally meet back up with her in the reanimation train station, like I said, and after calming down Huggy, both him and her were stabbed and seemingly killed by the evil beast 1006. And speaking of which, next there's the prototype slash Poppy. The prototype and Poppy are possibly the game's most complex and important characters, and I'm combining them as one here since they are technically the same creation, just at different stages, and it would be impossible to break down one character without fully explaining the other. Basically, in 1950, Elliot Ludwig, the founder of Playtime Co., created a toy based on his daughter, Poppy Ludwig, and named it Poppy Playtime, who was a huge success commercially. It's what was essentially the chain reaction that led to everything else that would happen in the factory later. However, tragically, a decade later, in the 1960s, Poppy Ludwig would end up dying, and in a panic, Elliot wanted to try reviving her as a doll, since behind the scenes, he had been experimenting with trying to resurrect animals with a mysterious poppy gel long before the technology for the bigger bodies was created. And to test the science of this experimentation, he took a separate child whose association to Elliot is unknown, named Oliver, and experimented on him to create Experiment 1006, the prototype, seemingly meant to be a large-scale practice model of Poppy, specifically her hand and arm, since in an x-ray of what appears to be the Poppy doll, we can see essentially a mini version of 1006's hand inside of her. And apparently this ended up working, as the prototype was sentient, intelligent, and could move. However, it quickly backfired on Elliot, as despite his good intentions with his daughter, Ollie hated being turned into this metal beast that was essentially just a test run to save another child's life. And he even coined his name, the prototype, himself, as to not be associated with his old identity Elliot took away from him.
My boy.
You don't get to call me that. Ollie's gone and I'm a test run. The prototype.
Elliot also didn't let Ollie meet Poppy after she was successfully created after the fact as Experiment 1007, despite her being what Ollie unwillingly sacrificed his life for, likely because over time the prototype was growing aggressive and more specifically violent. And not only was he angry, like I said, he was superhumanly smart, eventually, as far as we know, killing Elliot and taking his body down to Playcare, the factory's Poppy's in-house orphanage that they'd eventually source their test subjects from to try manipulating other children into doing things for him, only for both him and Poppy to be found a long time later by Elliot's descendants, who trapped and studied them. Nonetheless, 1006 hated this, as he continued to use his intelligence for violent attacks. Like, for example, while in containment, he turned his own alarm clock into a laser pointer and destroyed his observation camera to force someone to go inside and check on him, where he ruthlessly killed them. Despite his anger, though, around his creation, he still seemed to have a soft spot in his heart for the Poppy doll, because eventually they both were able to get into contact with each other through a Playtime phone and could talk amongst themselves about what was happening to them as experiments, where for a change, the prototype lifted his mask and went by his old name, Ollie, to her, comforting Poppy through the phone as she traumatically revealed the employees were taking her body apart piece by piece and studying it to learn how Elliot created her.
The bad men don't say what they want. They don't listen. It's been weeks and weeks of taking things out and putting them back in and taking things out and putting them back in. I'm nothing now, Ollie. No one.
You're not nothing to me. You're Poppy, and talking with you like this, I know it doesn't make any of what they do right. It can't, but it makes me feel like a piece of me is still here. I'm here, Poppy. For you, I'll always be here.
This all seemed to only frustrate the prototype further, as eventually he used his engineering skills to add parts onto his body, developing into this massive jester beast. And not just that, using his manipulation skills, he organized all of the other experiments to start a revolution in the aforementioned Hour of Joy, where they turned on the employees and killed all of them, with the prototype even experimenting on the ones that he liked, like Preston Willard, along with hiding all of these surviving orphans from Playcare to an unknown location, and creating a cult from the still living toys that worshipped him like a god. After all, he's the one who quote-unquote saved them, right? However, while we'll dive into this cult and its violent tendencies later in the video, after all of this was said and done, the prototype had another major goal, which was to reunite with the Poppy doll, the toy that he never got to see and the one that his own life was unwillingly sacrificed for. He searched for her after the hour, and eventually, thanks to that phone that, unbeknownst to her, was being used by the prototype hiding under the Ollie identity, he was able to talk to her and eventually locate her. So he trapped her away in a case, likely to treasure his life's only purpose. At the same time, while it's a bit unclear as to why, 1006 kept trying to learn how to experiment on his own, both creating and altering toys featuring later in this video. Again, a decade later in-game, as the player, after entering the factory, we see scratchings of the prototype around and a VHS tape of his claw, but otherwise we free Poppy with no signs of him in Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, we finally get to see him physically after killing Mommy Longlegs when he sneakily grabs her body to add onto himself. In Chapter 3, outside of him talking to us on the phone when he played as Ollie, he did the same thing after we defeat Catnap, killing him and taking his body, all of course while Poppy was still following and directing us deeper into the factory. However, in Chapter 4, we finally see him try to recapture Poppy, as he was searching for her around the safe haven, where at first she actually made it inside safely, and even informed to us that she had plans to defeat the prototype and end all of the madness happening down in Playtime Co. by blowing up the entire factory with dynamite from the bottom up. However, when we tried to do this, the prototype eventually took the dynamite for himself and blew into Safe Haven, as I said, killing everyone inside. After Poppy and Kissy tried hiding in the vents, the prototype revealed that he was Ollie all along, causing Poppy to run through a vent shaft, and then we enter the labs in search of her to see that her and Kissy were imprisoned in the house of Lily Lovebraids. We then, at Lily's tea party, see the prototype make his grand grand reveal where he attempts to finally take Poppy. He accidentally crushed her face, and once Kissy saved us, we seemed to survive his wrath until we reached that infamous train station where, after jumping and seemingly killing both Huggy and Kissy, the prototype chases us and Poppy down the train until we jump off, crashing it. He ended up somehow barely surviving this train crash and stabbed the player before taking the Poppy doll finally. Thankfully, we were revived seemingly by the prototype, who dropped us into the regenerative Poppy gel the factory had been mass producing at this point, before our other ally Giblet brought us back to consciousness, but Poppy's whereabouts are currently unknown. 1006 presumably took her even deeper into the factory to lock her away. Bron the dinosaur. Bron was one of the earliest successful toys from Playtime Co., originally created in 1961. And despite mostly being a minor character for the first few chapters, showing up through artwork and promotional material, he has actually had a few experiment versions of himself created as well. As for one, in the first trailer for Poppy Playtime, a large, bigger body for Bron with blacked out eye sockets can be seen, which also could be spotted inside of chapter 2 here, that sadly doesn't ever move, suggesting he's dead. 2, in the restricted restoration tape, we see the scientist Jessica Newman logging down the process of trying to experiment on employee Thomas Clark, who had contracted lung cancer and therefore volunteered to be turned into a little Bron toy for the sake of experimentation under the name Experiment 1199. This did not work, as he was unresponsive to most stimuli after experimentation, mostly just darting his eyes around everywhere. And when trying to place him into storage with the other toys, they could tell that he was an employee and not a child like the rest of them. So I guess foreshadowing the Hour of Joy, they ganged up and attacked him, nearly killing him in the process. And while he would survive this attack, getting stored alone for the time being, after the Hour of Joy, we see that the experiments eventually caught up with him. Bron had some other mini appearances, like being a red herring in a Chapter 3 teaser trailer to make fans think he was going to be the Chapter 3 main villain, and he was Experiment 1393 in the secondary labs. The good news, kinda, for Bron though, is that in Chapter 5, we finally saw that he had a real living bigger body holding the new grab pack, which essentially was just a monster used after the Hour of Joy to be given food and then have that food fall through his stomach to be eaten by the Outimals that lurk the factory. So maybe not the best way of life, but he's alive, I guess. Boogiebot. Boogiebot is still to this day the last known toy to be created by Playtime Co., made all the way in 1993, just 2 years before the Hour of Joy, and for the most part, there isn't that much known about him. He's another minor character thrown on various posters and art, nothing really much more, although he does make one physical appearance as Scout in the safe haven, who shuts the door for us after running from the prototype. Candy Cat. Candy Cat is another not very extensive character. She started as a toy in 1979, essentially being a themed gumball machine on wheels based on some concept art from earlier in the game's development. And her only real appearance in any game is actually in Chapter 5 when she is Lily Lovebraids' main companion. Cat Bee. Cat Bee as well is another minor side character introduced in Chapter 1, although she does have more presence and lore than the last few toys, as she's the toy that we create from the Make a Friend machine. On her toy box, she is supposedly a part of the Kitty Cat collection that apparently there were 5 of, along with being one of 2 known Swapimals in the game, a Playtime Co. toy line that allowed owners to swap the toy's body parts around. In some darker stuff, during the Chapter 2 ARG, we saw a living Cat Bee toy around the lobby where Huggy resided, until it was suddenly dragged away, presumably by Mommy Longlegs. In some concept art for Chapter 1, we saw she was supposed to have a demented bigger body version of some kind here that looks super creepy. Then finally, during the Chapter 5 ARG, her head was used by the prototype to create an experiment out of the employee Preston Willard, leading to this horrifying invention that is one of the franchise's creepiest moments. Make a Friend. Make a Friend is a machine that I never know if to count in these videos, because while they technically aren't Experiment, a documented experiment being created by Elliot Ludwig in 1960 for tour guests to play with and make their own toys. At some point, the machine developed the ability to follow the player with its eyes. This could have just been a feature of the machine or some kind of supernatural thing going on, or it could be an experiment in disguise. I don't know, but I thought I'd include it. That's all for chapter 1. Subscribe if you're enjoying so far, because this video is already taking forever. But now let's move on to the next game. Mommy Longlegs. Mommy Longlegs, unlike every other toy, was originally created as an experiment, Experiment 1222, being this pink stretchy spider made out of the child Marie Payne, one of the factory's orphans that became a victim of the red smoke, a red gas engineered by Playtime Co. to be administered to the children of Playcare, causing them to fall asleep. However, it was discovered that with children like Marie, it would cause them to have intense nightmares, leading to her violently screaming and going pale like a ghost when it was administered at night. This is what likely influenced the factory to move her out of Playcare and turn her into the spider-like beast in Mommy. And while she was a big success in the way that she could walk and talk, unlike most earlier experiments, she had a very interesting quirk, being that she seemed to relate to the children of Playcare unlike any other experiment, caring for them and almost being like a mother to them, while also being extremely violent to the employees, likely holding a grudge against them for what they did to her and what they were trying to do with the other orphans. They attempted to calm Mommy down by pairing her with a Daddy Longlegs bigger body, like what they did with Huggy and Kissy, but that did not last as she eventually killed him. So they caved in and moved Mommy Longlegs into the game station, the place where all of the children would be tested for experiment compatibility through various mental and physical games, guided by Mommy, while the employees simply watch from above away from her. And this was a big success. The children loved Mommy just as much as she loved them, to the point where they actually chose to make a toy based on the experiment and released it into the real world, debuting the elastic plastic, an extremely stretchy material, allowing the toy's arms to stretch out just like the experiment, releasing her in 1991 to big success. In-game, when entering the game station, she kidnaps Poppy and forces us to play through the station's minigames ourselves to get a train code that we needed to escape. And while we did successfully complete these games, Mommy's frustration broke through, as with every completion, she would kill all of the game station's monsters outside of PJ Pugapillar, like she did to Daddy Longlegs, and eventually went completely manic, deciding to chase us down herself, at least until we trick her into running into a grinder, causing her to get torn to bits, while after the fact, the prototype took her body to add to his own. Bunzo Bunny. Bunzo is the host of the first game in the game station, Musical Memory, where we have to play a game of Simon with these various buttons while he slams his symbols from above, and of course if he gets too close you lose, or in the case of the player, he kills us. However, when we survive, as mentioned, Mommy Longlegs finishes him off herself and even puts him up in her webs, but he does have a bit more lore outside of this game, as while we don't know much about his toy version or anything, back in Easter of 2023, the developers launched a choose your own adventure story, focused on what's presumably another version of Bunzo searching for eggs, where after crawling under where the prototype took Mommy Longlegs' body, he found an egg from high above and tried grabbing it with a grab pack, only to accidentally shatter it, revealing a baby bird inside. He panically runs to try and save the bird and eventually falls into a trap, leaving him stranded below the factory surface for days until he eventually died. Now, why there was was a bird egg inside of the factory isn't exactly known, but if there was a baby, there must have been a mother. So for a long time after this, people thought there'd be some kind of bird character, especially since in the final render of Bunzo's death, it almost looks like parts of his body had been packed, possibly by the mother eating him. Not to mention the baby bird is completely gone. But again, this was never explained, so pretty strange. A third version of him is seen in the secondary labs, experiment 1395 as well. Mini Huggies. The Mini Huggies were originally released as a cheaper alternative to Huggy Wuggy, being of course smaller colored versions of the original. And eventually they were also turned into experiments, becoming the host of the second game in the game station, Wuggy. These toys, as you could guess, were put inside of these holes that the player would have to smack as they crawled out before they reached us. Apparently they were supposed to have strings tied to their backs to protect them from actually hurting the kids inside during original testing, but Mommy Longlegs hinted that she broke them off during our playthrough. Fortunately, we survived, but unfortunately for the Wuggies, Mommy would kill them afterwards as well. Not that we were really at that much of a risk, as we can see in their models that they don't even have teeth, again likely to protect the children playing, but that means that they couldn't have really done much but give us an aggressive hug in the game anyway. PJ Pugapillar. As a toy, PJ was the second and final known Swappimal, who started as a small little dog slash caterpillar hybrid, but could then have other PJs added onto him to make him longer and longer. As an experiment, he hosts the last game in the game station, Statues, where the player has to move across a long playground, only being able to move while the lights are off and music is playing. However, periodically that music will stop, and so must we, or else PJ will attack. Eventually, we escape this fate, and interestingly, Mommy actually doesn't kill PJ unlike the others, as she gets sidetracked trying to kill us, so it's believed he might still be alive. Especially since in an experiment log, they noted that she was even bonding with PJ. Lore-wise, PJ has never really done that much in the factory's history, outside of being spotted by the employee Marcus Brickley, who saw him around the cafeteria, and not knowing of the experiment's existence, he was obviously horrified, although Leith Pierre told him to just ignore it, and that was that. Although another smaller PJ experiment can be found in the secondary labs as experiment 1398. He was also originally supposed to be a female named Cassie Cutie Pillar, but was changed later on in development. Barry. Barry is technically the name of multiple of the employee carts seen throughout the game. First spotted holding a bunch of toy parts in the game station that gracefully sacrificed his life to let us through a boarded up area. A second time holding onto an old employee body that we used to power on a door. Then in chapter 5, we see Barry as these platform carts. Thank you for your service, Barry. Barrel o' Huggies. In the rejected toys room, among many other toys, the Barrel o' Huggies are a small barrel of little Huggies, spoofing the barrel of monkeys that could be strung onto each other to make a chain. These toys were rejected because apparently they were a choking hazard, as children tried to eat them from the barrel thinking it was candy. Sunny Buddy. Sunny Buddy is merely a rejected sunflower toy who was originally supposed to be one of the game station antagonists during development, but was scrapped early on and put here possibly as an ode to what they were once going to be. They also look absolutely baked out of their mind for whatever reason. Surprise Hare. Surprise Hare is literally just an egg-shaped rabbit toy in the rejected toys room that does nothing and has no lore. Sorry, buddy. Sir Poops a Lot. Sir Poops a Lot is Mob's spoof on potty training toys that, despite being absolutely hilarious, was rejected because it had extremely negative reception from various focus groups, with management saying whoever's idea this was should feel ashamed. His toy box also revealed that he was supposed to tell amazing jokes like, "What's the best time to go to the bathroom? Who 30?" I like toilets for two reasons. Number 1 and number 2. Why did the toilet seat cry? She got dumped. He also appears on the totally official Poppy Playtime movie poster. Owen the Oven. Owen the Oven was a spoof on the Easy Bake Oven and was rejected because there were multiple cases of children receiving third-degree burns, because obviously you shouldn't give ovens to little children. The Orange Robot Toy. The Orange Robot Toy is a character never seen physically in the Rejected Toys room and is only known about through this Rejected Toys slip, mentioning them, saying that they were rejected because after considering both options, management has decided to go with Mommy Longlegs as Playtime Co.'s stretch toy concept, suggesting they were once meant to be the first toy to use the stretchy elastic plastic before selecting Mommy for the role. However, this character does have an interesting past because while we never see them, back when Mob was smaller, they were supposedly on the side working on an animated show of some kind that, based on the little art we've seen of it, featured none other than an orange robot toy with long stretchy arms. This character was put up onto Mob's old office, and for a little while people actually thought it was meant to be a new character for chapter 3 that they accidentally leaked. However, this was all likely just a reference to that other project and nothing more. The Pet Stone. The Pet Stone is a spoof on the real pet rock that actually existed, if you can believe it. That's literally just a rock with googly eyes on it. It was rejected because focus groups were confused. Kick Me Paul. Kick Me Paul was a ball-shaped child designed to be, well, kicked, that was rejected because, simply put, nobody liked him, and the documenting employee was laughed out of presentation meetings when revealed. They also tried rebranding him as Push Me Paul, but that was also rejected because management wanted a better name than Paul, suggesting to add Y to the name, an obvious self-deprecating joke at Mob's obsession with every character being Poppy or Huggy or Kissy or Doughy or Mommy, you get it. Love Bug. Love Bug, like Sunny Buddy, was originally meant to be a game station toy that never made it past the concept art stage in development, but some blueprints of the design were put on Elliot Ludwig's desk in the final version, leaving a fun little Easter egg for players to find, but otherwise they really do nothing. There was also a model for a Love Dog toy in the game's files, but was also never used. Daisy the Flower. Daisy is by far the most famous of the rejected toys, as she was originally supposed to be in Musical Memory super late in development, even being shown in the actual Chapter 2 gameplay trailer with full animations and everything, before being replaced last minute by Bunzo Bunny, and it shows pretty heavily in the game, as she still has posters and a cardboard cutout laying around meant to be in the title before she was scrapped, but they last second turned her into a rejected toy, with the reason for the rejection being that she was too scary for young children, and children in test audiences cry during Daisy's performance. Despite this, Daisy can still be found in posters for Chapter 3 as well, and the devs even turned all of this leftover material into lore for the game, as in Chapter 5, when the employees were asked to remove the wrong side Outimals branding from the factory after that toy line failed, they said to not rush it because the same thing happened with Daisy and she's still plastered everywhere. So that's a pretty cool callback. Daddy Longlegs. Daddy Longlegs was meant to be the male counterpart to Mommy Longlegs, and while he mostly is seen in cardboard cutouts and character art, as mentioned, a bigger body of him was created to try and tame Mommy, but he was torn to shreds. Baby Longlegs. Baby Longlegs, on the other hand, is the baby version of Mommy Longlegs, and like Daddy, they're never really used in the game, spared for some random art pieces. However, Lily Lovebraids in Chapter 5 did have a baby doll as one of her friends, so it's nice to see them reference that. That's all for Chapter 2, but next it's time to talk about the Poppy Playtime spinoff. Boxy Boo. Boxy Boo is the main villain of the game Project Playtime, Poppy Playtime's multiplayer game before, not updating it for 3 years. But it still contained one of the game's best characters in Boxy, who started as a Jack-in-the-Box toy created in 1966, themed like a monster. However, when Harley Sawyer was attempting to create his very own experiments after the passing of Elliot Ludwig, he had the idea to start the aforementioned Bigger Bodies initiative to make these large toys that would be easier to produce at a massive scale and could replace the employees as workers. To launch this initiative, he created the first Bigger Body experiment, 1160, Boxy Boo as a patient zero. This ended up being a success because while Harley's past experiments failed to live for even short periods of time, Boxy was mobile and survived long term, convincing the other employees to greenlight the program and have Harley make as many of these experiments as possible, under the only guideline that nobody outside of the higher-ups could know about what they were doing down here. However, after some time, the lower down IT employee, Rowan Stoll, caught wind of this after spotting the Bigger Body Huggy's eyes appearing like they had cameras inside of them, not knowing Huggy was actually physically alive, which led him to start investigating the factory further, eventually discovering that these monsters were all experiments that they were working on, to his absolute horror. To stop Rowan from spreading this information, they tried a couple things, like messing with the wheels on his car, hoping for a fatal accident. However, eventually they decided to put Boxy Boo to work and began tailoring his appetite to human flesh, which, along with his high agility due to his spring-loaded limbs, allowed him to hide in a room that Rowan eventually entered, and in a split second, kind of like a snake, he launched at the dysfunctional employee, eating him alive and hiding the secrets in the process. Boxy also has a lot of more speculative theories around him. Like, it's believed that since he resided in the theater, he might have been the one responsible for the theater incident, an incident somehow coordinated by Harley Sawyer, in which 66 visitors of the theater were mysteriously killed by an unknown beast or beasts. He also seems to be the toy that attacked Thomas Clark when he was Brawn, as we could see Boxy's hand grab Thomas in the tape, and can even hear what sounds like his music box right before it happens. It's also believed that the Playtime prison logo, which features 3 squares, red, blue, and yellow, is meant to be an ode to Boxy, sort of like a way of memorializing the first experiment of its kind. The Wuggies. The Wuggies are almost identical to the mini Huggies from Chapter 2, but with a few key differences. The Wuggies live in the feeding pit in Project Playtime that was used to dump food down to the experiments instead of being a mini game for the children to play in. And unlike the mini Huggies, these ones have teeth. They also come in a new variety of colors. Also, another green Wuggy can be found in the secondary labs as experiment 1391. The flowers. In one of Project Playtime's posters, we can find this artwork showcasing Daisy hanging out with a couple of her floral friends, a purple flower and a rose. What these characters are and why they even exist isn't ever explained. They could have just been for this one art piece and nothing more, but I can't help but feel like at some point they might have been characters alongside Daisy that never saw the light of day. Shoppy. Shoppy is a cash register with googly eyes on it, seen in the shop for Project Playtime. Then in Chapter 4, they actually brought them back in the toy graveyard, and even appear to have blood on them, so they could have at some point been a real experiment. Bucky. Bucky is the bucket that Bunzo holds in that one previously mentioned comic that released a few months after Project Playtime, but otherwise they don't appear in the game anywhere or anything like that. That's all for Project Playtime, but now let's move back to the main games. The Smiling Critters. The Smiling Critters are Playtime Co.'s attempt at making Care Bears, being a set of stuffed animals of various different creatures that all had scented cartridges they could dispense from their mouths to calm the children playing with them, kind of like Poppy with her poppy scented hair. They also had a show to go along with the plushes where they assigned different admirable traits to all of the 8 critters. There's Dog Day, who represents leadership, Picky Piggy, who represents making good food decisions, Kickin' Chicken, who represents being calm and cool, Hoppy Hopscotch, who represents being physical, Bubba Fit, who represents making smart choices and holding others accountable, Bobby Bear Hug, who represents love and compassion, Crafty Corn, who represents staying creative, and then there's Catnap, who represents getting a good night's sleep. Despite this line being Playtime Co.'s most ambitious, with tons of money put into it, it actually ended up being a big failure. Because for one, the cartoon was described as being creepy, specifically because of Catnap, who was a silent protagonist, and in one episode spewed a red gas to put the others to sleep, almost like it was some kind of drug. This episode, the only one we've actually seen, is very much similar to a creepypasta. While the plushes, specifically the Catnap line, were laced with the aforementioned sleeping red smoke that they were using in the factory. Whether they meant to do this or not, it caused horrific nightmares in the children that bought and played with the toys, forcing the Catnap doll to be recalled, although the damage to the reputation was done and the entire thing failed because of this. Despite this, the plushes themselves were eventually experimented on and can be seen moving about living inside of the playhouse, while some others were able to find refuge in the safe haven that we visit in chapter 4. There's even a dead experimented on Bubba Fin plush named Experiment 1399 in the secondary labs. Playtime Co. would also make bigger bodies of every one of these Smiling Critters, so I'll go over all the ones we know of right now. Bigger body Catnap. Catnap is Chapter 3's main antagonist and might be one of the most interesting characters in the entire game. Originally, Catnap was a child named Theodore Grambell living inside of Playcare. However, behind the scenes, he had an imaginary friend, the Prototype, who, as I mentioned earlier, was living down in Playcare, manipulating specifically Theodore into doing things for him, like collecting documents, or more specifically, at one point, the Prototype got him to steal 2 grab packs and 2 green hand attachments, so that way they could break for a back exit that required 2 green hand charges to power on. However, while making this great escape, Theo actually burnt himself with the green hand, and instead of just abandoning the child, the Prototype for some reason instead alerted his injuries to the staff, despite it leading to him eventually getting caught, so pretty strange. But anyway, after this, the employees decided to turn Theodore into Catnap, Experiment 1188, who would be given the ability to shoot out the red smoke whenever he breathed, with the goal of this experiment being to provide a safe and non-invasive way to disperse the red smoke around Home Sweet Home where the children lived during bedtime, without the orphans being scared. And while this did work, at least after a little while, when the children got used to him and his horrifying raspy voice after his voice box got damaged during experimentation, he was still seen being attached oddly to the Prototype, who he now viewed as a god after he pretty much saved his life, reportedly following 1006 around like a lost puppy, even claiming the Prototype will quote-unquote save us. Not only that, but Catnap, like Huggy, was seen having violent crash outs in the factory, as looking at his cage, it's absolutely torn to shreds. Along with, in an ARG tape, we saw the employees try to condition Catnap in the labs, but he ended up breaking out and started attacking employees. Eventually, he, like the rest of the toys, attacked during the Hour of Joy, and while most were left to fend for themselves, because Catnap was so attached to the Prototype, he was the main one manipulated into creating the entire cult around the metallic beast, making a shrine for him that he literally prayed to, putting candles all over the place, and most importantly, he punished those that chose to fight back against the prototype, including the other smiling critters I'll discuss in a moment. When we first meet Catnap in the game, he chose to actually watch us from a distance throughout most of the game, only attacking us at the very end after almost powering on the gas production zone, where he shoots the red gas and has us hallucinate a nightmarish version of him. However, when eventually poetically shocking him with the green hand in the exact same way he was shocked as a child, the prototype came in once more. Catnap then went to pray to him. However, this time 1006 chose to not spare him and instead stabbed the cat, dragging his body away to become a part of him. Dog Day. Dog Day was essentially the example of what happens when you go against the prototype's cult, as despite pretending to follow the prototype for a little while to avoid being harmed, eventually he was exposed for being a traitor, and as punishment, Catnap tied him up in the Playhouse prison, allowing the followers of the prototype's cult, being the mini critters, to feast on his body from the bottom up. When we finally run into Dog Day in the game, he no longer even has a lower half to his body, and despite him telling us to just run away, before we can, we see the mini critters attack him once more, eating up his entire body and possessing it in order to chase us down for their next meal. We do successfully escape, but Dog Day clearly did not. Unless, of course, you're one of those crazy people that believe, despite his insides being literally consumed, that he somehow survive this. Bobby Bear Hug. Bobby Bear Hug is a very interesting one because we found out in the orientation notebook that she was actually a failure originally when created as Experiment 1186, as she couldn't speak even though it seemed like she was trying to scream, and had a ton of stability issues, rendering her completely useless. However, they mentioned in this log needing to experiment on her further, and at some point I guess they must have successfully operated on and fixed her, as in a cassette tape after the Hour of Joy, we learned that she was working with the prototype, capturing and killing the remaining employees. Otherwise, that's all we know. Hoppy Hopscotch. Hoppy Hopscotch is another interesting character because originally she actually worked with the prototype as well, as in a different Chapter 5 tape, we heard her trying to collect the body of the employee Miss Gracie for him, yelling at the door, However, at some point, she ended up making a run from 1006, and it must have worked, as eventually she found herself inside of Safe Haven, where she went on food expeditions to feed the surviving toys inside. However, during one of these trips, she ended up being injured, and whether due to this or a separate injury, she was pronounced dead by 2004. Kickin' Chicken. Nothing much is really known about Kickin' Chicken, however, we do know he worked with the prototype as well, as he can also be heard trying to break down the door Miss Gracie was hiding in. Miss Delight. Miss Delight was originally a part of a set of teachers that were also sisters made by Playtime Co. that were used to teach the children of Playcare without having to hire actual teachers, of course. However, after the Hour of Joy, when all of these sisters killed the employees inside the school, they were suddenly a few days later locked inside of it for no known reason one morning with absolutely no food in sight. They attempted to figure out who locked the door, only being able to hear strange breathing noises outside, leading to Miss Delight crafting a weapon to defend herself from the beast out of rulers and pencils that she named Barb. However, as more time passed and the group got hungrier, it soon became apparent that to survive, the sisters were gonna have to kill each other for food, and Miss Delight seemed to be their first target. Eventually, she became so hungry she could barely move and only survived by playing dead so that that way her sisters wouldn't eat her. While at the same time, she began to speak to her inanimate companion, Barb, that told her it was either eat or be eaten. If she wanted to live, she'd have to kill and cannibalize her sisters before they killed her. And so after this realization, Miss Delight, using Barb, killed and consumed every single one of her fellow peers, finally satiating her. After this, the door to the school finally opened, and she found out the person locking her inside was none other than Catnap. And while she was obviously super furious about him doing this, he was far more powerful than her, and so she eventually struck a deal with him and the prototype. Protect the school from any other intruders, and he'd let her live. Which, of course, she did, at least until the player entered in the game, and after powering on the school's generator, she tried to chase us out. However, while doing so, we escaped and shut the exit door on her head, tragically killing her after all that she went through. That's it for chapter 3, but now let's get into the next chapter. Riley. Riley was once a child that only became an orphan taken in by Playcare in August of 1994 after losing her family to some kind of fire incident. But while she was in Playcare, she saw various children being taken out of the orphanage and simply never returning. She thought it was because they were all being adopted. However, we obviously know their true fate. Regardless, on February 10th of 1995, she was finally chosen by Dr. White. Thinking she finally found a family that wanted her, she was ecstatic. However, to her horror, after being chosen, she would actually end up being experimented on and would be turned into another Kissy Missy experiment that was then placed inside of a prison cell container. She was mortified by her new body when she woke up and was reasonably terrified. However, things would only get worse when a few months later, the Hour of Joy happened, and while she didn't involve herself with the hour, after traumatically listening to it from her cell until things went quiet, she chose to explore outside of her block to find piles of dead toys that looked just like her. If this wasn't disturbing enough, as time passed and she explored the now abandoned world around her, eventually she realized that if she was going to survive down here, she was going to have to eat something, and the only things that she could find were bodies upon bodies of experiments. This was far too much for her to handle. She would not bring herself to consume other human beings. So instead, she stole the utility room key that powered on the prison's entrance trains and hid it in her cell to prevent anyone from ever imprisoning any more toys down here, where she then starved to death, only leaving behind her corpse that we come across in chapter 4 before we then steal the key from her anyway. So I guess take the L. Nightmare Critters. The Nightmare Critters are essentially the second attempt at making the Smiling Critters. However, this time, to target a more teenage audience, they gave them edgier, more undesirable negative traits instead of good ones. Baba Chops was antisocial, Icky Licky was a sore loser, Raby Baby liked to gossip, Alistair Gator was lazy, Simon Smoke was egotistical, Poe was emo, I guess, which is kind of just like Baba Chops, but whatever. Tui is a yapaholic and annoying, while Maggie Mako was a glutton. There's not nearly as much lore about the Nightmare Critters compared to the Smiling Critters, although like them, they do have living plush versions as well that lurked around the prison, feasting on whatever food they could get their hands on. And we also saw in a note that they used to get along with these Smiling Critters. However, something eventually happened to drive them apart. While there aren't any known bigger bodies of the Nightmare Critters, in the Doctor's domain, we can find various quote-unquote medium bodies, I guess, of characters like Simon Smoke, Tui, Poe, and of course the main boss of that area, Baba Chops. Baba Chops is one of the Doctor's two pets, who we'll discuss here in a moment. She basically is just a slightly larger version of the mini Nightmare Critters that also spits this weird green goo at us in game. She doesn't appear to have much lore whatsoever. However, we do actually hear a Baba Chops trying to break down that door to get to Miss Gracie in chapter 5 that the other Smiling Critters were trying to get to.
Open the door, Miss Gracie. We just
So maybe that's this character, or maybe that's a separate bigger body. I'm not really sure. But like I mentioned, this is one of the Doctor's two pets, alongside Yarnaby. Yarnaby was a plush made in the 1970s as a part of a wildlife conservation initiative that was meant to be cuddled with by children while sleeping to, quote, keep the creeps away. As for his experiment version, back over in Playcare, they were studying a child named Quinn Davidson, who, after having a pretty mid-tier performance in the GameStation games, scoring only 2s and 3s out of 5, was consulted by Harley Sawyer and later retried the examination, showing this time even worse mental cognition in musical memory, only scoring a 1, while also nailing Wuggy with a 4 and getting a perfect score in statues with a 5 out of 5. This led to the employees deciding to select him for experiment 1166, Yarnaby. However, after experimenting on him, there was a pretty major problem, being that he reflected his GameStation scores almost too well, being both physically excelling as a monster, but also mentally kind of stupid, with Harley Sawyer saying he was, quote, hoping for a greater mind behind it. However, Harley noted that this low intelligence led to him having extreme loyalty and dependence on a few select security staff, giving him the idea to take advantage of this quirk of Yarnaby's by isolating himself with the rainbow-colored beast for an extended period of time, essentially causing Yarnaby to become completely mentally dependent on Harley, making him extremely easy to manipulate as a result. This would sadly go sour though, because after Harley mysteriously disappeared when being turned into an experiment by the other employees, Yarnaby became nearly completely disabled, not being able to do anything without the one he looked up to the most. This story does have a somewhat happy ending, however, because after the hour of joy, Yarnaby was freed and ran into his old friend Harley Sawyer once again, becoming his very own pet, which he used in-game to try and hunt us down. The only bad part is that after evading Yarnaby and jumping over a lava pit, he fell inside and died. So some very sad stuff, but I think now let's finally talk about his owner, Harley Sawyer / the Doctor. Harley Sawyer first became familiar with the factory back when he was a young child, as the founder Elliot Ludwig held a program called the Young Geniuses Program in the 60s to scout out young talent to help with the factory over time. Harley was a part of this group and held a very interesting relationship with Elliot, as while Elliot saw him as strong-minded and filled with potential, he also could see the trouble in him as well, since Harley, who had a rough life back home, appeared to be wildly cynical. While Elliot wanted to research and grow the company purely for the sake of helping others, Harley merely cared about all of this for the sake of progress at all costs, and called Elliot soft for having these ethical standards. So Elliot naturally had to remove him from the program, sending him on a spiral of anger. Eventually, years later, after Elliot died and the factory was in desperate need of a revival as it was going through a depression, Leith Pierre would end up rehiring Harley now as an adult. This would immediately become a success, as with the discovery of Elliot's own living experiments, the prototype and Poppy, Harley studied them and began to work on ones of his own. Now, while there wasn't much success at first when working with smaller experiments that only survived for minutes at best, as mentioned earlier in this video, he had the genius idea of making the experiments large with experiment 1160 Boxy Boo, so that way they wouldn't have to cram as many vital body parts in such small toys, instead doing it on bigger test subjects, eventually selling the Bigger Bodies initiative to the company as a way to save money on employees by replacing them with these bigger bodies. Even though realistically Harley didn't care about the business end of it as much as he just wanted funding to continue his research at all costs, the thing that he cared about since being a child. This worked well for a short while, but eventually the employees, like Elliot had in the past, began to grow frustrated with Harley Sawyer's cynicism, and it devolved to a point where a according to the lore, Harley had been involved in what they call the theater incident, leading to the death of 66 various people. As I said earlier, we don't know what this event was or how Harley was involved, but the important thing for now is that this is what sent the other employees over the edge, and they knew they needed to stop Harley before the factory was completely destroyed. So they chose to give him a taste of his own medicine by taking his body and experimenting on it themselves, creating Experiment 1354, the Doctor, connecting his body parts to the Playtime Co. computer system, essentially removing his body so that he couldn't cause any more incidents like this, while still allowing them to talk to Harley and use his intelligence to develop more experiments without him being able to do anything on his own. This would work for a while, and Harley was essentially left powerless. However, a little while later, the Hour of Joy happened, and when all of the employees were rushing for survival, the warden of the Playtime prison ran into Harley, who decided to cut a deal with him. The warden was in possession of the Omni Hand, the highest level of security in Playtime Co. that would allow its owner the ability to open essentially any high-level door in the factory. Harley said that if the warden would give him the Omni Hand, he could control all of the doors remotely, and offered to open an escape up for the warden to run from. He would, in a panic, accept this deal from the doctor for any chance of keeping his life, and while we don't know what happened to him after this, other than that he likely died, this now gave Harley access to the entire factory. All of its systems, doors, everything. Following the hour, Harley was eventually able to somehow create these robot minions, allowing him to transfer his mind to them, giving him the ability to physically move, while he still also fell victim to manipulation, this time from the prototype, the beast that he once studied. The prototype this time consulted Harley Sawyer for advice on how to create the experiments under threat of death, allowing 1006 to learn the scientific process and eventually develop experiments of his own, which we'll actually talk about in a moment. Harley also, as stated, reunited with Yarnaby and used him as a pet, along with Baba Chops that lived among the secondary labs near where Harley's computer system was located. This leads up to when the player enters into the factory. Right out of the gate, Harley was watching over the player, and being able to control Playtime Co., he messed around with us as well, opening and shutting doors during the Huggy chase, and even crashing the train after Chapter 2. Or at least that's what the game's former director said was the reason these events were written into the game during development, although technically this hasn't been confirmed, so take that with a grain of salt. Anyway, we kept moving throughout the factory, and in Chapter 4, finally face off against the Doctor. Thankfully, he's one of the easiest boss fights in the game, so we quickly deactivated him and stole the Omni Hand for ourselves to repair the safe haven generator, although this wouldn't be all for his story, as in Chapter 5, we learned that there were actually backups for Harley Sawyer's data that were created before the Hour of Joy in the event that something went wrong with him, and we end up using one of these backups in the data center by the labs to revive him, hopefully with the goal of helping us defeat the prototype once and for all in the next chapter. Pianosaurus. Pianosaurus was a music toy dinosaur among apparently an entire band of musical dinosaurs, although he is the only one seen in game. Experiment-wise, Pianosaurus was actually only the fourth bigger body, Experiment 1163, and unfortunately it shows, as he was described as being similar to a rabid animal rather than a useful bigger body, snapping at perceived emotion, eating whatever fits in its mouth regardless of appetite, combats the conditioning staff, and it cannot even play its insipid piano rhythms in tune, making him essentially completely useless. Despite how he was perceived though, as it turns out, Pianosaurus actually was so incognizant that he actually saw the world as overly bright and colorful, not knowing that he looked rabid and vicious to others, as he thought he was simply playing around with the toys that he was mauling. Eventually, after the Hour of Joy, somehow he survived for years to come, despite accidentally butchering any toy in his path without him ever knowing. Although in Chapter 4, we run into Pianosaurus eating another meal, and when he sees us, he barges towards us, thinking we were another friend for him to quote-unquote play with. However, I guess thankfully for us, he is grabbed and eaten beaten by the next toy, Doughy the Dough Man. In the 1950s, Playtime Co. created the Doughy Dough, which they made Doughy the Dough Man the mascot of. Also later on, making him into his own toy due to his popularity. Eventually, inside the factory, they wanted to create a bigger body of Doughy, of course. However, due to him being such a fat character in size, to create a toy of this scale, they need to use the bodies of multiple children to make him. They eventually found 2 children inside a play care as subjects for the experiment in Matthew Howard, one of the oldest and therefore wisest and most mature children in the orphanage, and Kevin Barnes, a younger but much more violent child. Then, in Christmas of 1992, a third child outside of play care named Jack would receive an invite to tour Playtime Co. And in January of 1993 would do so, only to tragically fall inside one of the machines that made the Doughy Dough, killing him. However, to avoid the backlash that a horrific accident like this would cause, Playtime Co. would try to quote-unquote save Jack by using him as the third child for Doughy, combining all of them together to finally successfully make the bigger body. Kind of. See, Doughy was functional and did seem to have some very good traits, as he displayed a lot of maturity rooted from the child Matthew. However, on the other hand, he would also battle with the other personalities of the much younger and naive Jack, as well as the more aggressive and angry Kevin, causing him to snap around these personalities on a whim and go from wise to childlike to angry. Anyway, their ultimate plan to silence this tragic accident Jack went through was to invite the parents of Jack to the factory, claiming that they were able to save him. However, when the parents would arrive, they'd enter a chamber to none other than the Doughy bigger body. The mother tried to be optimistic that her son was back, while the father was reasonably mortified. And eventually, the scientists would lock the doors behind them as Doughy snapped into his classic fits of rage, going completely mad on the parents, eventually killing both of them.
Susan, get away from me!
Jack?
Hey! Hey! Open this door! Oh, God. Susan! Please! Open the door! Please!
A little while later, after the hour of joy, Doughy, among many other children, hid inside of the safe haven, as I've discussed, and Doughy was even eventually designated as their leader due to his wiseness and strength. Now, when we meet up with him in Chapter 4, we see his personality shifts very frequently. At first, he seems friendly with us, saving us from Pianosaurus and guiding us into safe haven. Then, when discussing Poppy's original plans to blow up the factory, he gets noticeably very angry. And these are emotions that he bounces against throughout the entire game, until sadly, the prototype, like I said, blew up the safe haven, and he finally had one big outburst, blaming us and turning into a massive salamander, chasing the player down in the process, and even having 3 separate heads protruding from his mouth representing all of the children. Sadly, we were left with no choice here but to kill Doughy by exploiting his weakness with the dough, being that while it was malleable and kind of sub-liquid, we could freeze his body and cut it, eventually crushing him one final time with this large piston that finally does the job and kills him. The Medic. The Medic is a clone of BoogieBot, however this time they are red, and they're the ones that do medical work on the toys inside a safe haven. That's really all they do though. That's all for Chapter 4. Are you still awake? Well good, because it's time for the next chapter. The Wrong Side Outimals. The Wrong Side Outimals were another rejected toy line from Playtime Co., attempting once again to make a set of similarly themed toys, this time with the quirk of them starting off as one plush, but being able to be turned inside out to create an entirely new one, that also can be drawn on and customized too. This line includes Bubby Chums, the octopus/fish, Blanky Blanks, that is literally just a completely blank rag ragdoll plush, Doodle Bones, which is some kind of monkey, Bindle Boogie, which is some sort of apple-themed humanoid plant, Goober Guts, who appears to be a cat, Dizzy Boo Boo, that looks like a squirrel, and then there's Loopsy Noodle, who is a rabbit. Now, this toy line would ultimately not make it far into production, as despite Playtime Co. making a commercial for the line, and even producing some of the plushies, during focus testing, parents were not fans of it at all, specifically saying that the idea of turning toys inside out was satanic, and even reminiscent of Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial killer arrested in 1991, confirming that these toys took place at some point after that. And one of the parents even thought a paintbrush in Doodle Bones' mouth was meant to be a doobie or a marijuana cigarette. The Outimals. Inspired by the Wrong Side Outimals, the prototype, once he learned how to experiment, decided to turn various toys inside out himself, as some kind of demonic form of entertainment, I guess. Specifically, there are two breeds of Outimals seen in the game. Ragbag, these smiling critter-shaped plushes, and Gutter Plush, who are whatever in the world these things are meant to be. There isn't much lore known about the Outimals, since they're kind of just Chapter 5's mini critters equivalent. However, the prototype didn't just turn these minor toys inside out, as he also did the same with the next character, Giblet. Giblet appears to be some kind of fox or dog who, as a toy, had a heart for a nose. Not much is known about his toy version. However, we do know that he was eventually turned into an experiment and was targeted by the prototype who turned him wrong side out, which is why he looks much more disturbing than any of the other regular toys. Following the Hour of Joy, Giblet ended up working with the prototype for survival, collecting the bodies of employees like a lot of the bigger body smiling critters. However, he was noticeably much more hesitant about doing this, as he would tie up the employees instead of killing them because he simply couldn't bring himself to do it. Over time, he stayed quote-unquote loyal to the prototype to avoid an even worse fate, while also building his own home base, and eventually he met up with the player that miraculously made it down here, guiding us through the factory's deepest depths. He also has this handy electric staff that he used as a weapon and eventually to save our lives. Despite being friends with Poppy, who at some point knew him before being turned wrong side out, judged by her horror when reuniting with him, he also had his reservations with her, specifically around the fact that she originally wanted to blow up the entire factory, which, similar to Doughy in Chapter 4, he thought was absolutely crazy. Speaking of Poppy though, after she ends up getting stolen by the prototype, as I said, Giblet used the staff to resuscitate us, and seemingly plans to stick with us on our journey to Chapter 6. Giblet's friends. In a checklist from Giblet, we saw that he owed a lot of people favors. Some of them we knew, like Doughy, but there's also a lot of names we don't recognize, like Boggy, Mooch, Diz, Ziggy, Gabby, Tib Tib, and Roach. None of these characters are ever identified in the game as far as I know. We can assume that ones like Diz might be experiment versions of the Wrong Side Outimal Dizzy Boo Boo, but it's never explained. Globy. Globy was a star-shaped invisible ink pen toy where children could write hidden text on paper and then use a black light on the toy to reveal the writing beneath. In-game, we use a standalone Globy device of our own that doubles not just as our flashlight and blacklight, but also is our companion throughout Chapter 5, responding and reacting to the world around us with all sorts of adorable faces, which I absolutely love. Chum Chompkins. So Chum Chompkins is a Huggy adjacent character with a similar bright hairy design and has a mouth for a belly. While we don't know much about him as a toy, since like Giblet, he is literally never seen as a toy, we do know at some point a bigger body of him was created, not being able to talk, but rather instead using sign language to communicate, which is a pretty cute touch. Although oddly enough, as an experiment, he was originally made with the purpose of calming the children in the factory down, specifically by putting the children inside of the monster's mouth, even though it's established in the lore the children didn't like it. I don't know, man, I didn't make the lore. Anyway, eventually the Hour of Joy happened, and from what we see in the game, it seems that Chum was forced to work with the prototype like many others. Specifically, he seemed to be pretty handy as he uses tools throughout the chapter, and we can also see that he collected the body of the employee Preston Willard, who, after hiding during the Hour of Joy, attempted to run away when Huggy Wuggy spotted his hiding spot. And all of this was done at the same time that he paired up with Giblet against the prototype. In the game, we only see and walk around with Chum a couple times before he sadly pats us on the head and leaves us to never be seen again. Lily Lovebrains. Lily Lovebrains, like a lot of Chapter 5 characters, started off as a toy that we don't know all that much about. However, right before the Hour of Joy, the employees started plotting to turn her into an experiment. This never materialized as the Hour of Joy ended up killing all of them before they could work on it. However, the plans were still laying around, and eventually after the Hour of Joy, as I've mentioned throughout this entire video, the many experiments working for the prototype went around hunting different employees until they captured none other than Miss Gracie, also known as Gracie Green, who worked as the lead counselor running the conditioning tapes that were played on loop for the toys to twistedly convince them that they are and always were toys, doing other sinister stuff like advising Huggy during his conditioning to literally kill the toys that disobeyed. Anyway, her direct involvement with the experimentation led to her being especially despised by the prototype, and once she was captured, he decided to reuse these leftover Lily Lovebraid's plans and turned Miss Gracie into Lily himself. However, he wasn't done with her, as after this, he locked the experiment inside one of her own conditioning rooms with her tape playing on loop for over 400 days. Not to let her die, but rather to sadistically watch her suffer, providing her the bare essentials to survive while she torturously watched these tapes brainwash her and cause her to completely forget her identity as Miss Gracie and instead embrace being Lily Lovebrains. Eventually, the prototype would move her into the Sweet Street dollhouse to have space for other things. However, Lily's mentality would only get worse as she would quickly feel extremely lonely, since with her completely forgetting her past identity, she quickly realized that nobody wanted to visit her and she didn't know why. Eventually, she made friends of her own in Dolly Grub, Baby Longlegs, and Dusky. Now, I'm not going to dive into these characters separately because they're literally just meant to be your friends, and that's all. Anyway, she quickly became extremely insecure about nobody, specifically the prototype, liking her, actively trying to impress 1006, hoping he'd come over, while also masking her mistakes, like when she accidentally put a hole in the wall, she covered it with her favorite poster. However, she did still find a couple of living friends, since as mentioned, after Poppy and Kissy went through the vents, they were captured by Lily and put inside of her prison in her basement, which finally led to the prototype wanting to visit her for the first time to collect Poppy in what Lily considered to be a party. We also became a part of this party when Lily spots us in Sweet Street and has us gather crumpets and her friends. However, secretly, we ended up unlocking and saving Kissy and Poppy, enraging her and causing her to literally tie us up into our seats until none other than the prototype arrives. As we've already discussed, Kissy ends up coming in clutch to save us, but this enraged Lily further and caused her to chase us up and out of the dollhouse until we reach the clouds and drop one of the ones that she was standing on, causing her to fall and tragically die.